I'm gonna do 8 at 1:30.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I hope that was a long and productive, in terms of stomach rumination, lunch session there. Everyone's filled up, hopefully not too sleepy from that. And now we're going to continue with the rest of the day's program. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mariam, who's the head of research at the Abu Dhabi Health Services Company, acronym SIHA, right? So Mariam, please take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It's a very difficult task to give a talk after lunch. I hope at least 50% attention span I can get. Just to give you a brief background about what we do, I currently reside in Saha head office, so we oversee all clinical research activity across the network. We engage with different stakeholders, academics, pharma, biotechnology. We do different scopes of projects in addition to very closely working with regulatory bodies. For my background specifically, I can't preach to the choir. I'm a pediatrician by background, but I do have further training in clinical research and AI in addition to innovation in healthcare. So we'll take you to a different scope from the morning sessions. We'll be more focused on healthcare. We're not going to go too technical, so we're talking from a healthcare provider perspective and from an industry perspective. And I'll focus more on clinical trials specifically because this is the emerging field that we're trying to venture into. And this is with the leadership guidance and what's expected from an R&D perspective in the healthcare sector. So since most of you, if not all, are experts in AI, we know that AI has promised to change the landscape of healthcare, and it is. It's in the top 3 fields that's game-changing when it comes to service provision in healthcare. Although what we've seen in practice for the past 5 or 10 years, still it's in its infancy stages. So when you go on clinical grounds, you don't see it as active as it is in research or literature. And this is where we really can make a huge difference in. From a healthcare provider view, we have very limited, so maybe I am the exception here, from a healthcare, as a physician. We don't have a lot of trainees specifically going into healthcare and AI because of the traditional learning journey of physicians or healthcare providers. So routinely it will take any time between 12 and 16 years to be a subspecialized physician or a healthcare provider. And then going into further, more technical training like data science or AI or health economics will be an extra burden for them. But this is the trend that we're looking into now. So you have a healthcare provider plus, so they have to have extra training in artificial intelligence and data science and clinical research, some sort of other specialty that can combine and bridge the gaps between the fields. Again, AI can address many issues when it comes to healthcare. It depends on what clinical need or question you have in mind. Specifically, the workforce crisis has been very prominent for us. It was even more prominent during COVID. There was a huge collapse in healthcare systems because of the deficiencies. We're unable to meet the demand based on what we have currently. So, for example, if you look into the prospected shortage in healthcare providers by 2030, In NHS specifically, you'll have a shortage of 250,000 healthcare providers, which is a big number. And globally, we'll be deficient by 18 million. So we have to address that deficiency somewhere. And AI can be a good leverage in that. Healthcare is a very costly field. If you notice at the any country budget or GDP, it goes into three main areas. You have army, you have education, you have healthcare. It's a very costly field that we can, again, work around with AI to bring that cost down and better accessibility to patients. You're looking into the service provision you have to give, the outcomes, whether it's diagnostics, whether it is interventional, whether it is improve operational business operations within the healthcare sector. AI can really help with that. It's an interplay between the advantages and disadvantages, and it has been proven that the advantages we have we will gain from AI are surpassing the disadvantages. True, we are losing some jobs if you're automating certain processes. For example, radiology is a common theme that they discuss, where you have a lot of radiologists being replaced, or a lot of the functions can be replaced by AI. But again, these are additional tools that support clinical supportive tools that can help the existing manpower. So, we've already gone through this. Looking into the market size of artificial intelligence in healthcare, again, the forecast for the next, let's say, 8 years to up until 2030 will be a little close to 200 billion, which is a huge market by growth, compound annual growth rate of almost 40%. So we're looking into expansion, and whether we like it or not, we're headed that way. How did COVID affect AI utilization or adaptation in healthcare? It was a great, let's say, extra nudge or a catalyst that really helped the healthcare sector to quickly adopt AI into healthcare. You can see, for example, from 2019 up to 2021, in a 2-year span, it went up to by 167. And then they're projected over the next 5 years, it can reach up to 50% growth rate, which is, again, a great catalyst for us. During COVID, it was really exponential, kind of plateaued after COVID, and then now it's picking up again. The applications vary. Again, it's a very broad categories. Not all of them are mentioned here. One of the major areas we're looking into is diagnostics and treatments, and that's really as supportive tools for the healthcare providers. Computer vision is a very hot topic for us, especially when it comes to radiology and ECGs or EEGs. Improving workflows and processes when it comes to optimization of patient follow-ups or clinic show-up rates. Predictive modeling is, again, active in this field. For example, one of the topics we worked into, or one of the projects we worked into during COVID, was the prediction of complications in the first 24 hours after admission, whether this patient will require ICU or he will go, the mortality rate of complications based on the certain parameters we looked into. And this is very important for resource allocation, especially in times of crisis. It will help leaders and healthcare leaders to really know how to allocate the services. You can expect by a certain number that you will require, for example, distribution of field hospitals, ICU beds, ventilators and stuff like that. In addition to the outcome we look into when it comes to complications. Given the deficiencies of the manpower we have, virtual assistants will be extremely important. Here you notice clinical trials and drug discovery. For AI specifically in clinical trials, and we'll go into a more deep dive into that in a minute, there are two aspects. Either you design randomized controlled trials to assess your AI solutions, or you utilize AI within clinical trial designs to help optimize its operation and cost. So it's in the studies, it's noted that because clinical trials are usually very costly, even though biopharma companies will pay a large amount of money to support clinical trials, it can drop the cost by 30%. patient participation, recruitment. If you want to run a trial to test a drug or a treatment or a device or whatever, you have 1,000 participants that routinely may take 2 years, 3 years to participate to finish the project. You can, optimize the operation of recruitment of these 1,000 within 6 months. So you've narrowed down the window of the study down to 6 months. In addition to that, on a molecular level, especially for drug discovery, AI is very active again in phase 1, phase 2 trials. It's being more utilized on early phase trials rather than late phase trials. These are some of the mobile apps, again, because of the wearables and big data we can get from wearables. It's an active area for chronic disease management and remote patient monitoring. A lot of hurdles come across that, especially with the systems built here. But again, there's a huge future opportunity in that area as well. When you divide it, you divide the again the market size by application. You can see the largest is actually clinical trials. This is where we're headed to in the future. And it's very promising because you can build a perfect model with a perfect AUC that predicts very well, but when you go on clinical grounds, you're surprised that after deployment, the performance is not functioning as required. So these will help overcome these deficiencies or reporting of results that may not manifest as required on a clinical setting. Assisted robotic surgery is a common area. Fraud detections is very important, especially with the insurance systems we're building here. You have a lot of data from claims in insurance companies that you can really cut the cost of fraud by big chunk. And this is one of the areas everyone is interested into. Although it is very, there's a lot of emphasis on it, what we see, as I said, on clinical grounds is not reflected to what we see on papers or research. So unfortunately, out of 100 AI companies or startups, you'll have less than 1% that will have valuable service on grounds in the healthcare sector. So there must be a deficiency somewhere that we need to address. Why is it, with all this data and models and projects we have, very few are actually seeing the end of what we need, which is on clinical grounds. As I said, cost saving is a huge part of how we can leverage AI. Robotic surgery is estimated to have cost saving by 40 billion. Clinical trials participation identifier by 13 billion. Virtual assistance by 20 billion. Workflow assessment and operational improvement by 18 billion. Fraud detection by 17 billion. Okay, these are just figures for us to understand the weight of how we can leverage things forward. This is a very dear slide to my heart. This is one of the greatest assets, I think, as a healthcare provider we have. We know that data is the fuel for a lot of the work we do here. But just because of the availability of data doesn't mean that it will translate directly to quality of care for us at the end of the day for patients. We had the advantage, especially for clinical data. The electronic health records we use have been implemented in 2008. So we have a good wealth of data for more than 13, 14 years. And it's really comprehensive longitudinal data that can be utilized very well for research purposes. How much we can extract from it, it's not the most research-friendly data, but it requires a lot of cleaning and mining and management to optimize it for research. And here in Abu Dhabi, they've integrated the government and private sector into an even larger platform called Malafi that can capture at least basic data from different sources and even a larger population. Claims data, as I said, for revenue cycle management is very important. They have good realm of data, not as detailed as clinical data or what we have in EMRs. Research data, it will depend on the project itself. They're a smaller set, especially when we look into registries, for example. We have a lot of disease registries that can be translated into good outcome. Genomic data is a hot topic nowadays, especially with the Emirati Genome Project. The UAE Abu Dhabi specifically, has done a great job in implementing the policy for genomic studies here. They're still in the recruitment phase, but if you look globally, we're considered a small population compared to other countries. If they're trying to sequence at least the locals 1 million or 1.5 million, it's not a reasonably big number compared to other populations, but you'll have most of the genomic data there for precision or personalized medicine into the future, giving the other source of data you have. It will be really a game changer for the future of our population's health in the UAE. And this is an ongoing project which we are part of. Patient-generated health data through wearables, social media, smartphones, apps, is a good source of data, especially for chronic disease management and for longitudinal studies. Regulatory data, especially we work closely with the Department of Health. They do have good one of data, but especially the Malafi platform I talked about. Social determinants of health usually was overlooked previously, how it affects directly the health of the population. Through statistical data and surveys, we can get, again, a good source of data on that. A disclaimer, we do get frequently asked by different companies, academic institutes, to tap into our pool of data. There is a lot of processes and steps that we have to go through to assure that, privacy, integrity of the whole process is there. But we're all usually, because we're a healthcare provider at the end of the day, it has to be a mutual partnership with other entities, which we usually have. This is a very interesting study, although AI has been into the picture, for more than 40 years, but for healthcare specifically, in the last 10 or 15 years, it has boomed very nicely. It's not translated into the clinical setting per se, but from a research perspective, it's there. Although there are shortcomings in terms of the reporting of what we see in the studies, and the implications are how I can translate it into our clinical setting is an issue. And we'll take out of this, so this is for generally AI in healthcare. We'll look into more details for clinical trials within AI. For AI-based global AI-based clinical trial solutions, you can see again there's a growth rate by 2023 by 22%, averaging around $8 billion US. So it is a market that's growing even more. So when we discuss clinical trials related to AI, it's only been relatively active in the past 7 or 10 years. When you do a literature review of all the studies that are registered in clinicaltrials.gov, which is a platform that registers all relevant trial, interventional or non-interventional trials into that platform, whether you're testing a drug, a device, an AI solution or whatever. It is registered there. This is an open public platform that you can review of all the data. We're not mandated to use it, but if you want visibility more on the public domain, it's better to register your trial there. So in that, we see that it has the registered trials related to AI has dramatically increased since 2016, but again with poor quality results reporting. So there's some element missing there. And there may be a somewhat equal distribution between interventional and observational trials. Real-world evidence trials is still not as active as we'd hope to see here in the region, despite the good realm of good data pool we have here. But for the interventional part, it's less, and the reporting is not as required. But it has you can notice the exponential increase, especially with COVID in 2020 and 21. And it's expected to increase even more over the next 5 years. Predominantly, as I said, it was early phase trials, phase 1, phase 2, so we're talking drug discovery because of the usability of AI on a molecular level. And it is mostly dominated by the pharma, the market share mostly goes to pharma because they're investing heavily into AI and they are adapting fast into utilization of AI in healthcare. And naturally speaking, since the US has large number of trials ongoing, it has the biggest pool of AI-based trials. This is something that's been mandated more or less from a government level to activate the clinical trial sector as a whole in Abu Dhabi. And since they're trying to attract investments, whether it's through AI, biotech, healthcare is almost on every other day we receive one request from a company to try either to test their solution, tap into the data, or integrate their solution within the healthcare system. And naturally, from a provider's perspective, if I don't have proof that this model or the tool you have built on a different population set may not have the same effect on ours, we're naturally inclined not to go ahead with it unless there is really proven benefit for the patients and the system. So I'll take you through a scenario that's one of the cases or tools we try to implement within our system of a common disease we have here. Breast cancer is very high prevalent here in the UAE and for a younger demographic. So even the screening guidelines are screening younger population. So what's 50 in Europe or US, here we're screening starting at the age of 40. The aggressiveness of the disease, the behavior of the disease is different. The genetic background, mutations behind the disease is different. So you cannot really take any other solution that is based in other countries and really place it here. And I'll show you one scenario based on that. So if we're going through the 4 steps, you identify the problem that we need to solve. We always say start with the problem at mind. What clinical need are you addressing? In this case, we're addressing breast cancer and trying to improve the screening rates for early detection to improve the outcome of patients. You find clean, accurate, and store the data for at least 2 years worth of historical data, which we have. We can go up to 5 years and even 10 years. Clinical data, radiological data, biopsies, genetic testing for the patients we're trying to screen. You build your model and you identify the outcome we want to. We said which is the improving in the outcome of patients who may have breast cancer. We're targeting here women age 40 and above. So I took this example of one of the scenarios we had in one of the POCs discussed recently within our system. So without going too much into the medical background, let's say you have a 54-year-old lady who's hypertensive and diabetic with good control. They have annual screens of mammography every year or 2 years, depending on your risk score. They start age 40 and above with minimum risk. If you're high risk, they may decrease the age down by 10 years. She came to the physician for a routine checkup. The physician orders the mammography. On the background of the workflow that's currently going, we're testing in a screening tool, a computer-assisted or aided detection tool for 2D mammographies for lesions or abnormal lesions in the breast. So that's happening in the background, and the standard of care is still provided for the patient because this is on trial basis. The system is built in a way that, based on the reading by a score of 20%, anything above 20% may have suspicion of abnormal lesion for further review. If it's less than 20, then most likely the patient doesn't have any abnormality. I'm summarizing a lot, but it has more details than that. So, and we compared it to the radiologist reading. The radiologist, again, looked at the 2D mammography, and he saw, okay, I don't see any abnormality. The system reads only 2D images. The radiology, on the other hand, the radiologist is reading the 2D and the 3D images. The model is trained on 2D images. So the radiologist didn't pick up in the 2D images, and this is an experienced radiologist that review all screening mammographies, hundreds, if not thousands of images in a month. On the 3D mammography, they've looked into an abnormal lesion that was not present in the 2D images. So based on the 2D imaging, they've classified as pyrite 2, which is, less like, it's a low score, no need for further intervention, just follow up every 6 months or 1 year, depending on it, with no biopsy needed. On the 3D imaging, the BI-RADS score was higher. BI-RADS score is a score the radiologists calculate to see what would be the next step radiologically. Either just follow up with mammography, intervention is required in terms of biopsy, or something else is needed. On the 3D imaging, the BI-RADS score went high, 1 to 4 or 5. So in this case, it mandated biopsy. So you recall the patient, he has to go through further testing. The physician did, ultrasound-guided biopsy, and the biopsy revealed DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ. So this is a cancerous lesion that's still in the ducts of the breast. In such case, if we rely on the screening tool, we're talking only screening, we're not talking advanced diagnostics or interventional. We're talking on a basic screening tool. If you miss this, and the patient end up for the next round of screening, which is in 1 year, probably she'll end up with metastasis, at least to the lymph nodes, which is a devastating effect on the patient. And this has, we have zero tolerance for missed cases like this. That's why it's important to design the tools. As I said, the performance of this one was great on paper, on published papers. When we go on clinical grounds, we prefer to do the 3D model rather than the 2D model because it will give a better screening for the patients. So these are some of the summarizing all the common challenges we look into using AI, especially in clinical trials, performance and deployment. The performance, as I said, from building the model to prospective validation would be different. And then deployment is another issue when you look at it in clinical grounds. We have to consider, because we're looking into populations and patients, the deployment, if the model is built in a different population set, European, American, or Asian, as opposed to our Arabic region or Arab population, the performance will be 20 or 30% less. And this is not acceptable. That's why any model built has to be built on our population with our variables, because the genetic pool, the makeup, the demographics, everything is different than what's experienced outside. The patient safety is of utmost importance. There has to be a safety network or a safety plan for in case there's any missed cases or wrong results accounted for. And then the accountability is a major issue. Is it the radiologist's responsibility? Is it the healthcare provider? Is it the division or whoever approved the solution for it? So accountability is an issue here. Mismatching the clinical workflow. If the performance is great, and let's say it's almost 100%, but it's interfering with the recall rate and the time, the interval from intervention to diagnosis is longer. It requires more admission, more procedures, more investigations. True, you're detecting the lesion earlier, but there's 10 other steps that causing more delay or more cost that we're really operationally not benefiting from the solution we have. So that aspect has to be accounted for. Unnecessary recall, the increased false positives or false negatives, which is similar to the case we had. If there's a false negative and you miss, a case, it's devastating for the patient, but there's a false positive, you have a high recall rate and all the associated costs with it. There's anxiety from the patient, there's unnecessary cost of bringing them, testing them again. You're extending the period, overloading the radiologist we have on top of the shortage they're having. So there's a lot of implications if you have high recall rate. Technical requirements, it depends on the solution at hand. We have to account for, because everything may be perfect, but we don't have, especially with the closed systems, health information systems we have for hospitals, we may not meet the technical requirements to actually implement the system within the network. And then finally, the resources within the clinical settings, because again, these things are costly. Designing them, testing them is costly. If you're talking to a healthcare provider, they don't want to increase the cost on them. They actually want to cut on cost. And we're asking them to improve his services to spending extra costs on this solution, which will give us quality, but at the same time is very costly. So it has to be balanced in a way. So from a larger point of view of how to integrate AI, or a roadmap to actually integrating AI into healthcare on a larger system-wide level, has to go through a very lengthy but very meticulous process. So again, we start with a clinical problem at hand, or whatever operational problem we want to address. You set your inclusion and exclusion input and output. You look for the data, you manage, you get the proper data, you design your algorithm, and then you have to train your clinicians or your healthcare providers, and you educate them. If they don't know how to use the system and they're the end users at the end of the day, it's useless to implement it. We have to get a lot of regulatory approval, especially if there is, privacy issues, data utilization, access to different data from outsiders to our network. You have to do the prospective validation, then you deploy it into ground. Once deployment happens, you can really design a randomized controlled trial to really assess your solution in the right way. This on its own will take some time, minimum 6 months to 1 year, if not more. And then if the results are promising and satisfying, you can implement that on a guideline level, which again requires another round of expert opinion to be included and adopted on a system-wide level, which will require, again, resources. This is a proper way of handling the robust AI solutions and technology we're having. If it's not assessed well, it may have implications on the patient outcome. So the way forward, this is just a nutshell on some of the things we can consider for the future of AI in healthcare from a healthcare provider. Sorry. Increasing the number of randomized controlled trials designed to assess these technologies and tools. Precision medicine is a hot topic, as we said, especially when looking into pharmacogenomics. If you can design or give a drug based on what's best suited for the patient, based on his genes and based on his response, you decrease the side effect and you increase the efficacy of the medication. And you spare the changing of medication for the patient, you have saved a lot in addition to providing the quality of care for the patient. Oncology area, pharmacogenomics is active, cardiovascular, metabolic diseases, rare diseases, is some of the early projects we've noticed in that. Research and development, especially in drug discovery, it's happening in other parts of the world. We need to bring that here in the UAE. Again, early phase trials, even for phase 3, phase 4 trials. For phase 3, phase 4, if it's not related to the design of the trial itself, we can, again, use these solutions for better recruitment, decreased cost of clinical trials, which will bring in more trials to us. Regulations, again, I say this one word, but it has a lot of implications related to it, especially in the healthcare sector. We're kind of noticing that a lot of the regulations related to AI in healthcare are happening on the go, which may not be the optimal way of dealing with it, but it needs a lot of regulation, especially with the implementation of AI within the network. Areas that we may explore is federated learning, because there is a lot of data sharing happening between different countries and different parties. Federated learning will be an interesting area to explore. Data encryption related to the health information we have, especially with the closed loop systems within our networks, looking into the privacy and confidentiality. One of the issues related to the type of data we have, because of the reporting and different sources of data, the quality and integrity of data may be suboptimal. As they say, junk in, junk out. This is very true for healthcare. If it's medical health records, it will depend on the documentation of the physicians. If it's claim form, it's very preliminary data. If it's imaging, it depends on the source of imaging you're having. There's no clear answer of how to improve medical data specifically, but starting with the people entering the data, which are the healthcare providers, if you can unify or centralize the way, and they have done to a certain extent with the diagnoses and templates they use in EMRs, but it still requires a lot of enhancement. So this is in a nutshell a quick overview of AI in healthcare with a focus on clinical trials. Thank you for your attention, and I hope it's an easy topic after lunch. Thank you so much.
All right. So once again, we have time for questions. Would anyone like to take the and ask a speaker here some intriguing, thought-provoking questions?
There's one online when you want.
There is one online. Okay. Well, in a bit of a, since I can account for everyone that's in the room raising their hand, how about we read out the question that's online? So, Philip, would you be able to read that question out?
Yes, the question is, does SEHA have an AI or ML system in place or in the pipeline for medical IoT?
So as of today, we don't have any AI powers within our institute itself. We do rely on partnerships with others. As I said, because we're a service provider at the end of the day, we haven't invested too much into providing supercomputers and AI experts within the network, but that's why we rely on industry partners to work on that.
All right, thank you. And then now for our in-person audience.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's quite informative. In the diagnosis phase, can you still use artificial intelligence, advanced artificial intelligence as a support system, as a decision support system in the healthcare industry?
As a decision support system, yes, but not on a standalone tool. It has to be an assisted tool to physicians because of the safety reasons. So for diagnostic purposes, if you're looking into screening or you're looking into specific diagnosis, again, it depends on the disease you're looking into and it depends on the level of diagnostic. If it's simple screening, it's more reasonable because you're on the safe side. But again, if it's things like, for example, TB. If you have, thousands of immigrants that come or expats that come for TB screening, and if you rely on chest X-rays for screening and you miss one case of open TB, that's a hazard to the community. So it depends on what level you're considering. Assistive tool or CADs, yes, but not as a standalone tools as of yet. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is Hussein Al-Nashif from Beyond Limits. My question is related about data. Maybe at the level of Abu Dhabi or UAE, is there like a centralized data or data warehouse for historical medical records? And if so, is there any projects to access it and make some discovery or of patterns and predictive analytics on that?
So I'll talk about our network because it's the largest network within I. So Pure Health has different assets under it. Saha is the largest one, but you do have other hospitals that are running a pharmacy, for example, Pure Lab, the Life Corner, which is the pharmacy, and Laman, which is the insurance arm, all under the same network. That's accessible in a way. But again, our system has maybe 13 hospitals and 30 plus clinics within the same system. That's good bulk of data. The second layer, you have Malafi, which is integrating the private and the government. But again, the type of data there is not as elaborate as the one you have within the healthcare network itself. They do look into, for example, reports of radiology, but not the images itself. Basic, historical data of admissions and discharges, lab information, visits, discharges, dates, and stuff like that. But it's not as elaborate as the network you have in the first layer. These two layers are very good in terms of the data you have. There has not, from my limited experience, there has not been proper solutions and never, especially digital solutions and leveraging this data. You have good data, but it takes a lot of back and forth, interfaces or interaction to really get that data you can utilize for research or for your models. So these two layers at least are available within the Emirate of Abu Dhabi.
Okay, so data there, but not yet utilized enough. Maybe looking to partnerships or open innovation initiatives.
Yes. So for our system specifically, we've implemented a simple request system for data access. So, but this is accessible to our researchers. So any entity that's coming from outside that wants to tap into our data, they have to have co-investigators from our facilities. So it's a mutual benefit. You get this exchange of knowledge and expertise. They can tap into and request for data through our system. The analysts work on the data depending on the requirements we have, and they go from there. But it takes, again, a lot of back and forth.
Thank you.
All right, then. Are there any more? Is there a
Here.
question at the back?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
So thank you for the presentation. It's very, I mean, the information is quite really valuable. So there's always resistance, right, from every industry, and I suspect the medical industry is no far from the resistance, the human element, the medical practitioners per se. So how do you see this, and how you're tackling this side of because I mean, like you said rightfully, is without people who understand or practitioners who understand how to utilize and optimize those solutions, then there's no value to be generated. But is there any reskilling, upskilling throughout the process of those medical practitioners? Thank you.
You're welcome. That's a very valid question. And again, I still believe that with all the machines we have, manpower is the greatest asset we have. So we can take a look at it from a top-down approach and from a down-up approach. From the top-down, the leadership has to have the vision of really having, or having the intention to integrate all this technology which is coming, whether we like it or not, into the healthcare system. So they do have scattered training here and there, or based on personal interest, people will get training, but it's not at a larger scale from what I've seen. The other end is for our junior trainees that they go up, because it's a long journey that healthcare providers have. They're starting now early from the undergrad school, for pre-med schools, to really integrate, especially with the previous system we had was, 6-year, medicine, and they go into specialties. They don't really have different experience in other areas. Now, with the pre-med and med system, they do have different background from the bachelor degree. So they may have engineers, data scientists, or whatever that go into medicine. So they have that combination, but at the same time, they're focusing on educating these undergrads from an early on stage to have this, because we're not looking into only 1 or 2 years from now. We're looking into having something sustainable across the future. They have to design specific programs, and you can see now a lot of it is being done for the undergrad and postgrad, even trainees. Even from a clinical perspective, if you have a board-certified physician or an RN, or a nurse or a PT or whatever, they go into subspecialization. They can't go into things related to AI and research and stuff like that. But it's still underserved, I would say. And it will require, again, a lot of training, will require maybe as much investment as R&D when it comes to really leveraging that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Philip, do we have any other questions that are online?
Yes, there's one more from Alex Myakov that says, first of all, great talk, thank you. And second, he says, in your opinion, where is the most friction in the healthcare system at the moment? Is it lack of proper AI solutions, or is it complexity in enforcing healthcare protocols which allow for early disease screening?
I would say both, honestly. We have the system, you have to understand the landscape, especially here in the UAE, is different than what's represented in other places. It's fairly new, and we're catching up very nicely in this field, especially in research in AI, but it's still fragmented in a way. So us as a healthcare network, we don't have that strong arm when it comes to AI research, specifically from a healthcare provider view. That's why we rely on partnerships with different, academia and industry stakeholders. Regulation is an issue, especially with dealing with partnerships and external entities. It has to be regulated from higher up, down, for all the entire network across. Thank you so much.
All right, well, let's give another round of applause to our speaker.
Thank you for your attention.
And at this point, I would like to introduce our next speaker to the stage here. Please meet Yuri Gorbachev, who is the OpenVino architect and fellow at Intel Corporation. And by the way, OpenVino is an open source project, right? Did I get that right, Yuri? Okay, right. So that really fits into, just speaking as a castle organizer here, that really fits into our theme of, having open source to serve the community. So it is with great pleasure that I'd like to welcome again Yuri to give his talk on opportunities and challenges when bringing AI to production.
Okay, so it's coming into.
It was okay.
How is it
Yeah.
now?
It's
just How is it now?
connecting and disconnecting. Is it possible to
Still
get the
going
feed in presentation in the copy?
No? No? Do you mind if I take a copy and I put it on
Yeah.
the
Can
computer?
you have a stick?
okay.
Can we? In here? Yes. Can you get yours?
Yeah.
True.
Just keep like this. It's just touched.
All right, and please excuse us for the little bit of a technical delay as we're trying to get the speaker's laptop set up. So we'll be online shortly.
Just a check.
So I think it's this one probably. Okay. Sorry, we're bringing presentation to production now.
Where are you sitting? You want me to put this?
Just put it there. So. All right. Sorry for that. It's not usually how we do production. So yeah, so let me start with short introduction. So who am I? And like I'm representing the team here, team that is working on set of products as part of Intel. One of the products is OpenVino. This is the framework that we are creating for years now. So we as a team came from the company called ETSYS. This has been like 6 years ago or so when Intel acquired this company, but prior to this we've been doing a lot of computer vision. So as you can understand, that time it was mostly like classical image processing, classical algorithms, not AI, not deep learning or anything like that, but since acquisition and since the kind of, I think, 2014, we have seen a lot of adoption on AI in this space, and practically everything is now solved by AI. So we have witnessed the whole path of moving from concept, from research, to the stage where applications are now in production. So we see somehow that is the same thing that is happening now with the large models, maybe on the accelerated scale, but it's somewhat similar path that that the technology is taking. And one of the things that I think was differentiating us is that not only we were working on research or not only we were working on production, but we were doing full cycle. So we were trying to talk with the customers, we were trying to suggest how the things are working, and then solving the problem, the real problem, in a way how we could do it. And as a company, we were kind of associated with the product or with the library that is called OpenCV. This is the open source library for computer vision, and quite a lot of algorithms there. So we kind of were doing that for long years, and since joining Intel, we started doing something different, but we wanted to inspire from this. So we built a framework that we called OpenVino. But the whole reason why we started building it is that we saw that basically we could not do the same thing as we used to do with the classical computer vision. We could not bring AI or deep learning to the production. We could not do fast inference. We could not run models on the hardware which do not have powerful GPU available, which do not have powerful infrastructure available to perform the computations. And it was not something that our customers wanted to see, right? So as well as we have seen way more opportunity on low power system, on edge systems, and in general on the most widespread systems, on the laptops, on the desktops and things like that. So similar things are happening now if you try to propagate this to the large language models that we were discussing prior to the launch. There was a lot of conversation about how we keep this sustainable, how we keep this working, right? And the numbers that are shown here, they are really shocking, right? So it basically means that not so many companies can run those models very easily. So that is the investment, not to talk about even creating the model. Running those models in production is a huge investment. So last time, everyone were making jokes about Google making bad advertisement of their own ChatGPT. But the reality is somebody did a compute that, to run ChatGPT on Google scale would require 100 billion investment just purely in the hardware. So if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense for Google to do something that probably is not as sophisticated, not as powerful as ChatGPT, but it can solve the problem, and it can solve it on a wide scale. So we try to do the same thing for deep learning now, and we work with a lot of customers, we work with developers. So there was this very good talk about healthcare. So majority of the solution providers that are doing healthcare now, somehow using OpenVino now in the deployment. So we know what they're doing. We see the scenarios that they're doing. Things like radiology, things like ultrasound, those things are solved already, and they are deployed on a wide scale in the efficient manner. So we kind of see what customers are doing when they try to productize AI, and we know what they're looking for. We know the problems that they're trying to solve. So maybe I think it would be useful for us to share what's going on in the established fields, so that when you look at this from the large language models perspective, or the problems that you're solving, you will be able to say, hey, maybe this is something I should account for when I'm designing something. Maybe this is something I should think about when I'm doing it. So the experience that we have is like over the past year, just confirmed, we have like 300 production customers using our system. So we see the problems that they're going through. And I just wanted to share a little bit what we see, so that, you know, maybe we are making evolution of those fascinating models faster, so that they are adopted faster. So to start with, the thing that we see now is that, you know, research and production, they are actually starting to diverge a little bit. So it used to be like 5 or 6 years back, you know, people were doing research and using the same code to do the production, right? You know, you make a like certain model and then you just make it run in production. This is already good. This is already great results. So not anymore. Now people look for something more. To get on the wider scale, people look for something more adoptable. So they look for solutions that are working on the data sets that they have, not only on the public data sets, or not only on the models that are created on those data sets. They look for tasks that are very specific to solve. And to do that, they need to solve the problem from day one on their data set, and preferably without knowing the internals. So, you know, we know what, I hope we all know what BERT is, what GPT is, what's the difference there, right? Underneath, this is the encoding, decoding, things like that. But reality is, when you bring the AI use case to production, you don't care about this. The only thing that you care, or actually the only thing that customers care, the only thing that developers care when they do it, is if it works or not, and how good is the quality on the problem that they are willing to solve. So this created the entire ecosystem of solutions that are allowing to prepare and execute model without knowing what's inside, as long as they do it very efficiently, as long as they do it conveniently. Things like Hugging Face for text, for example. Take a look at this, right? So nobody looks inside the model anymore. Nobody looks inside if it's T5 or something different. You just update the model on your corpus, on your text, and then you start to infer this. So this is actually what customers are looking for. Sometimes they start from scratch, sometimes they start with pre-trained checkpoints, but really most of the production caring customers do not think much about what's inside. They think of the outcome, but they do not care much about what's inside. So when it comes to large models, when it comes to scenarios that were discussed before, the biggest question here is like, is there anyone who can actually reproduce this without doing extensive research on how to deploy this thing, on how to run this on the huge cluster, how do you configure sharding between them and things like that? Can you do that on the small GPU maybe for a longer time or not? Can you do it or not? If not, then this is not for wider scale. So this would remain as a niche for research engineers. So this is something that will be eventually solved, right? So I'm just saying, if we are looking at this, we should consider how to do that in a more lightweight. Think about people who are solving the problem for a particular data set, not thinking about what's inside this model. So, and we see that across the board, by the way. So computer vision is the same. So there is a rise of repositories, and there is a rise of products that are just taking images, taking annotated images, and produce the model, and then update the model. So things like that are evolving. So I would expect that, you know, for the future, the large language models will also be produced more easily. So right now, this is not the case, obviously, because of all those investments that are needed. But eventually, I think the cost and probably even the size of those models will reduce, so people will be able to reproduce it. Even at the universities right now, the biggest challenge is the infrastructure and, higher cost of getting into the game. You need to get educated a lot before you can produce at least reasonably workable model. So that's one. Secondly is related to this as well, especially for the large language models, but in general. What we see now is customers adopting a lot already pre-trained models. So either they use them as a base and then update, or they take them and just use as it is without major modifications. So for the large language models, the problem is even more dramatic. So we did an analysis maybe a week ago on how many open source models, large models, are available right now, and it was substantially less than 20. With the large number of weights, it was probably 1 or 2. So you could probably go and find more, but really, even the conversation that was happening here about the Arabic language model, is this model available to the widespread audience so that people can use it and produce something as on top of it or not? If we are talking about the licensing and things like that, this is already stopping the evolution of the small companies and small customers. So those type of things are very widespread in the computer vision and the text processing now. For large language models, this is clearly not solved yet problems, and generally for large models. So this is where the whole industry will be probably moving if there will be a demand. So the entire situation with Bloom model, for example, people produced the model because they wanted to inspire the research on it. So they open sourced the model. So that's what something that will be happening. But right now, for those models, there is a very little opportunity for the outsider to come and to start doing this. OpenAI and other companies, and even the TII here, have a courtesy of finance to produce this from scratch, right? So, but in reality, not every company can even afford that. So then, really, this would probably be solved. But the problem that will likely remain for a long time is availability of data, and not only the availability of the data, but actually how you bridge the gap between people who know what data means to the actual data and how this gets into the model. So we talked about, there was this conversation about healthcare. So simple example, there was this breast cancer picture. So I guess I'm like 99.999% confident nobody knew what picture is wrong, left or right, because we are not experts. But some of us probably data scientists. We can prepare the model. We can prepare the model that will classify between right or good, but we don't know what's right and what's good. Radiologists know that, but they are very expensive and very limited resource. So how do you make use of this resource in the most efficient way? How do you explain the task to them in a way that it is so understandable, so clearly interpreted by them, so that they can say, yes, it is correct, or not, it is not correct. Most likely, it would be some sort of application that you create for them to say yes or no, and that as simple as that. Or better, if you can kind of use the existing data. But the real problem is the access to the data, and in some areas, this is one of the most blocking points. For the healthcare, the exact reason for the rise of federated learning is actually inability to share the data even between institutions. Different hospitals cannot share the data between each other. So even though they have the same problem that they are fighting with, they cannot share this data unless there is a special signature and things like that. Data cannot leave country premises, things like that. So all of those things are really blocking for the models, for the use cases evolution. Simple companies, when they're starting from zero, might have good idea on how to solve certain things, but they don't have access to the data. For the large language models, when you are talking with the chat GPT right now, you're actually training this model. So you're producing data yourself, right? And so it's actually the reason why this whole model is available for free, because you are training this model with your inputs now. You're training and saying, yes, this is correct, this is not correct, and the model learns on you. Right, so the access to data and actually analysis of data and how the data is interpreted is the problem that will remain. So there was an example in the very beginning as well about if the email is correct or not correct, or like if it's customer churn or not. Really, what you will see is that this solution will probably not work in the very beginning. Because on some of the cases, because the model is not sufficient enough. So how do you make use of the people who are already answering the emails right now to produce more data? How do you use that data? And then continuing this. So typically the model, when like we are talking about the model, we think about this as something that already existing entity, as existing artifact. That's not the case, really. So the existing artifact is that you produced once, but then you need to update this model. You need to kind of optimize it for your use case more and more. In case of answering emails, model will be answering emails wrongly, probably. It will be classifying emails wrongly, but you need to continue evolving it. So from that standpoint, models have to have few characteristics. First of all, you shouldn't treat them as, okay, mission accomplished, we have a model now, so let's just start using it. Secondly, there should be methods that will allow to optimize this model with the new data. Even when you produce the data from the real life scenario, you should add this. But then probably the previous data set that you were using already before is not available anymore. So how do you update the model, not lose the previous knowledge and add the new knowledge? So the zero-shot learning and things like that, those methods will continue to evolve. And then, you know, quite a lot of scenarios are happening around deploying a model, seeing a problem, and then rolling it back. So this is automated scenario. So what we can expect is that customers will be using models in scenarios where they will deploy few versions of the same model, will check the analysis, will check across the model, and check how those outputs correlate and things like that. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that everybody thinks about a model that, you know, was produced once and then it can continue to live forever. So this is not the case. Model will need to be updated and will need to be considering the actual use cases more and more from the deployment. And then what we see also on the customer side is monitoring of the deployments for the models. So really what happens is that in some domains you can deploy the model. This model will be deployed in the scenario where it is completely not working or maybe working to some degree. So then the scenario changes. You basically start producing correct outputs. So in the case of answering emails or something like that, there might be a situation when people will be using different language at some point, different phrases, or they will be asking about the actual products, for example. So like imagine customer writes and says, hey, my particular TV setup is not working with your cable or something like that. So how will model react on it? So you need to look at the cases when the model is not confident about the answer that it is producing, check those cases, collect this back, and maybe at the same time combine the experience that customer support engineers have. So this is what customers are using in production now, but how does this work for the cases when the large language models are deployed? This is also a question that we should probably ask ourselves. How do we analyze that the data that we are getting is no longer applicable to the models? How do we check that? So right now it's a little bit it is understandable that we are in the phase where the whole space is just exploding. We see a lot of use cases, new use cases that can be solved with the generative models. But how do we monitor that they actually produce the correct result when we deploy them? This is one of the biggest challenges. Imagine the situation at Microsoft now when people started complaining about ChatGPT actually treating them to expose their personal data. So this is the huge problem for Microsoft, I would say, because they deployed something and people starting to make jokes about this, right? So where's the guarantee that customer is writing an email saying he's seeing spotty connection and model is not responding back that I will expose your personal data to the internet if you're not stopping to send me that emails. Imagine this situation. This is totally possible, right? We're seeing cases when Microsoft and ChatGPT solution, ChatGPT is just constantly saying that person is in love with ChatGPT. So this is the situation that preferably should be detected before customers start complaining about this or bringing this to the Twitter in the screenshots. So how do you do that? It's one of the biggest problems. I don't know. Maybe having multiple models, one is monitoring another or something like that. There is a huge opportunity for research here, and the problem is clearly not solved right now. So then, one of the things that we see, and it's been a while already, is the rise of AI for the production of the hardware for AI production. So when you train the model, it's really quite obvious choice. You need to have a huge cluster. You need to have a lot of data stored somewhere. You need to kind of effectively interconnect them. You need to, reduce the latency and things like that. But when you bring model to production, there is a completely different environment. There is a completely different goal that you need to follow. It's either latency or power footprint or maybe different constraints. And actually, the real problem is if you continue using the same cluster as you did for training, for deployment, this is just inefficient. So there is a huge opportunity for improvement right now, and customers are moving to this space. They try to understand, how do I make my model deployment more efficiently? On a very basic scenario, you can reduce in certain cases over the cost of ownership for a model inference by 4x if you just switch between different software frameworks. This is a very easy thing to do. Think about this, 4K reduction. For Google, it was said to have, I think, 36 billion to run ChatGPT on Google scale per year. So if you reduce that by 4x, that is a substantial amount of money to consider. That's why they do all of those optimizations to the models. That's why they sometimes suffer the optimization. So in this particular case, we see that customers are moving to this domain because they want to have more efficiently. For large language models and in general for large models, this problem is as huge as ever, right? So customers will be thinking about this. They will be thinking how we can reduce the cost, in which environment we will need to move this. There was a discussion about sustainability. This is one aspect, and it was only about training. And inference, by the way, the deployment is substantially higher than training in case of large language models specifically. So then, what we also see is that customers tend to push AI on the edge. When I say edge, it could be differently treated. Sometimes the edge could be like a camera for computer vision, individual camera for computer vision. But sometimes it could be really the installation on customer premises, micro cloud or something like that, like a combination of few hardware blocks installed at customer premises. Customers really want to have control over what's going on with their models. They want to have control over what's going on with their data that they feed. Sometimes they don't have opportunity to send that data anywhere. So like in case of healthcare, think about two scenarios. One scenario is on hospital premises, you have a system that analyzes patient cards. This is the NLP task, doing task summarization, then making a conclusion based out of it that, maybe this patient requires a little bit more attention. This is a little bit quite futuristic scenario right now, but the work is ongoing on really doing this. And the second scenario is, ultrasound. There is really a smallest system. If you go to the hospital now, you will get the AI-powered ultrasound system that will segment your organs probably. So they will help doctor to correctly see which organs do you have. Sometimes, it changes a lot. But those cases are happening, We see this. So for large models, I think the tendency would be, first of all, that customers would want to have them on premises because they want to have control over them. They would like to have a reduced footprint for those models, but also have a control over them. So how this would be moved? So you can even have environments where there is zero connectivity. Like for industrial scenario, you have a factory which is totally closed. In China, a factory is totally closed. You cannot have connectivity within this factory. So how do you make a solution on customer side, on the company side that will run those models, efficiently run those models? I think this is one of those things that we are seeing right now on the smaller size of the models, but eventually the requirements would be the same. It's just obvious that this would be happening. And then, on the other side, there is a movement from edge. I was talking about rise of AI hardware. So edge is actually increasing the capabilities. So instead of using like AWS with the NVIDIAs or using DGX systems, you have more lightweight systems that can do inference of the models on scale. So this is moving to, first of all, on the cameras, this is happening, on the clients, this is happening, and then on the smaller data centers, this is happening. So thinking about how to bring this model to the constrained environment from the very beginning is beneficial. Can we reduce the size of the model? Can we run that on something more than NVIDIA? I think it's an interesting question. So there is a solution right now, I think it's called FlexGen or something like that, that is actually allowing you to run model on one particular small gaming GPU, large language model, on one particular gaming GPU. This is happening because people want to try it somewhere else outside of the cluster. It could probably take longer, actually it takes less, but it could probably take longer, but they still want to try it. So this is what will be happening. So thinking how those models fit into those scenarios is really important in my view. So just running large language models is one thing. Running them efficiently in the smaller setup is another thing. So I think it's something that we see already now. And then I just wanted to say a little bit what we've been doing as a framework. So we did this again because we wanted to solve the edge problem, but then we eventually switched to the data center setup. So we created a framework that has very minimal dependencies, and quite a lot of overhead was reduced because of this. So if you take like a PyTorch or if you take a TensorFlow, you have a lot of dependencies that you need to manage. So we tried to reduce that because of the customer's asks. We tried to move customers to the stage where they can make a cross-hardware portability, so they could run on different hardware. You want to run on GPU, you can run on CPU as well with the same application. This is important because in some cases the environments are really different. And then model optimization methods. I will show you a little bit small example if that will play. But you know, with the very simplistic model optimization methods, I'm not talking about switching from the framework to the optimized framework, but with very little optimizations like quantization and pruning, you can get very easily 4x improvement for certain scenarios without substantial, you know, research on how to optimize it. This is already a solved problem in some cases. So adopting those things is really saving, you know, for customers and for business, because the reduction of the cost of ownership. So I just wanted to show you a little bit. I don't know if that will play. This is you know, what is possible with the edge right now, and with the use of the framework that we have. You see, this is the plain CPU. This is the CPU with quantized models. And this is integrated GPU. This is very available integrated GPU, and this is a quantized model for integrated GPU. There is no difference really on what's going on. So this is the different production, different models producing different outputs, but they match, as you can see. But the difference, if you check this is 4x. So this is what you can do quite easily already now. So I think future for large models would be really this. If you can produce the method that can quantize it and make 4x efficient, and you know, this starts with actually 2x improvement by switching simply from framework to our framework. You get 8x improvement in speed. And I think, you know, for models of that scale, this would be the mainstream eventually. Right now, it's obviously not there, but you know, this is where it will be going. In a year, or maybe less than a year, given the speed of how this whole evolving, this would be the trend. So getting prepared for that and thinking how this could be solved. I know that Facebook is solving some transformer optimization problems and things like that. This would be really beneficial. We are capable of running stable diffusion now on very basic laptops. So people can just take basic laptop. This is free of charge. People can take the basic laptop and just run stable diffusion there. So you don't need to have a cloud. You don't need to have a GPU for that. So this is very simple scenario that is available. ChatGPT not available right now, but yeah, we will try to get to the point where we will be probably at least running something, maybe, you know, on the GPUs or something. Okay, and just as a conclusion, again, I just wanted to say, right? So, like, if we are considering where the whole direction will be evolving, I think it's, yes, as a summary. So customers will be trying to optimize for the operation expenses, right? So they will be moving to a production environment. They will be moving to potentially closed edge solution. And then they will be consequently doing optimization of the models. And availability of the models is extremely important. So right now, we are not at that stage. And, you know, releasing some models, if the research is going on, this is critical. And yes, you know, again, preparation for deployment is a critical piece here. I think I'm done. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's now question and answer time. And actually, I do have a question for you, Yuri. So, you know, I think in your entire talk, right, you brought up this vision that the infrastructure and software and even hardware ecosystems for training and inference are starting to become, with good reason, separated, right? And it made me wonder, specifically for some of these larger pre-trained models, you know, one of the difficulties that happens during inference is that because the model parameter sizes are large, you still have to split them across multiple GPU devices. But then, you know, your talk got me thinking, well, obviously CPU VRAM is an order of magnitude larger than GPU at minimum, right? You can easily stick half a terabyte to a terabyte on a typical server with 4 more sockets. So has there been any like investigation at Intel on doing inference on, say, a model in the couple of tens of billions or couple of hundreds of billions of parameter range, that size that's a size where you can't fit it on a single GPU, so inference becomes a problem. But on the other hand, you don't need as much computation for inference. So there, it seemed to me like the advantages of a CPU architecture with its larger amount of DRAM, right, would become more evident. So that's my question. Has Intel done any investigation into that setting?
Yes, this is perfect question. This is something we are doing right now, right? So clearly, clearly the models are working, right? The only question that we are evaluating right now is how do we do this more efficiently? Because even if you have a lot of VRAM, there is a caching architecture in the CPUs, which requires a little bit of optimization for. But in general, yes, this is absolutely correct statement. I think for CPUs, this is a huge advantage of having a lot of memory and not having a need to split between different instances. So this we will probably do somewhat automatically, even within our framework. We are doing this in research or let's say prototyping right now already.
Right. Anyone in the audience have a question for our speaker?
Hi. Thanks for that talk. One thing I was curious about is how does like OpenVino, you'd say, compare against ONNX runtime in terms of pros, cons, or feature sets?
Well, it's a little bit, how to say, it's a little bit interesting question. So first of all, I think those are from the same domain, right? So like for Intel, ONNX even have OpenVino integrated underneath, so there is opportunity for that. But we were trying to differentiate a little bit by looking at more interesting features like integrating pre-processing, doing cross heterogeneous in the execution on the hardware. For example, we can run models on CPU plus GPU, splitting the models between different IPs and things like that. So we also kind of expanded to support Macs and other capabilities. But generally, those are products from the same area. I think, if I would be judging, I think we have a little bit more optimization capabilities, especially when it comes to quantization and different low precision capabilities, because you need to prepare the model for that. And we always support the latest Intel hardware, so to say, at first, of course, right? So like right now, we have a discrete GPU support.
NVIDIA has a hold a grip on basically all the deep learning training. Everything is supporting mainly for CUDA. Mm-hmm. You can't run on any other kind of GPU devices and other providers. Even in inference, it's still using CUDA to optimize everything underneath. For OpenVino, you have plans to support other vendors of processors for CPUs other than Intel?
We do support ARM already now, so you can run on Macs with ARM. We have contributed. We have open source support for NVIDIA, by the way, as well. Mm-hmm. So this is being evolved, and yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to play here a little bit, not as, let's say, truly Intel product. We try to build something open source which could benefit others. When it comes to training, I agree on NVIDIA footprint. I think this is good argument. But there is TPUs that are evolving as well, and specifically from Intel, I know that we have a team. I'm not fully familiar on the state there, but we have a Habana which is doing large language model training as well. And this is the training accelerator specifically. This is not GPU or any general purpose compute. So I would hope that this would be a better performance and cost per watt or something like that. Because at this scale, this is really becoming a huge problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
All All right, if there are no more questions, let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, maybe let me just check if Philip is Philip in the room right now. Okay, so no questions came online. Okay, that's perfect. Right, then it's time for me to introduce the next speaker before our break. So we have Yong Hao here from Carnegie Mellon University, who will actually be speaking on one of the Castle open source projects. His talk will be titled Efficient and Sufficient Communication in Training Foundational Models, which means these large pre-trained models. Okay, so we'll give our speaker a few moments to get set up.
Yeah, I guess.
No sharing screen. Yes.
Does it work? Oh yeah, it works. Hi, I'm a first-year PhD in Carnegie Mellon, advised by Erickson, and this work I want to introduce was with an intern student of Qirong in MBZU AI, and also with some Berkeley colleagues. So it is about efficient and sustainable. Sorry, I mistyped the title. Communication in training foundation models. So let's begin with the challenge for scaling. That is why there are challenges for training foundation models. The key challenge is that the entire model fits on a single machine and GPU prior to the era of the foundation models, where we just use data parallel. And nowadays, the foundation models are too large, so we can no longer use data parallel anymore. As we can see that the largest GPU has only 80 gigabytes of memory, while the largest model is far larger than that. So our previous experience on the data parallel fails. And what next we are doing is that we introduce the so-called model parallel techniques. And there are two types of model parallel. One is we call inter-operator parallel. One is intra-operator parallel. We categorize them by that. One is where we divide the operator into multiple devices, while the other is that we divide different operators into different devices. In the graph here, the left column is the intra-operator parallel. As we can see, one matmod is divided into two devices. And the second column is about so-called inter-operator parallel. That is, different matmods are on different devices. And to fully utilize the inter-operator parallel, we have to execute them in the pipeline style. That is the right bottom graph shows. So the two techniques are not good. So first we discuss about the tensor model parallel or the intra-operator parallel. This graph shows that the common intra-operator parallel requires a lot of time for communications. It is really, really large. And we have to mention that it is on NVLinks or the fast TPU pod, where the communication is about hundreds gigabytes per second. But if we want to scale that to cross nodes or cross TPU pods, then the network bandwidth will be only tens of gigabytes or only single gigabytes. So at there, we can imagine that the communication will be takes hundreds more times, and that's unacceptable. So based on that, and by the way, that even if you use very high bandwidths, it is very energy consuming. As we can see, the red bars or red lines are about the normal Ethernet, while you see the green or blue lines are about the infinite band. And we can imagine that the EFA used by AWS is also very energy consuming. So if we accept that we have to use the low bandwidth stuff, then we have to go into something called pipeline parallel, which has less communications, because only at the boundary we divide one subgraph to another, we need one communications. But pipeline parallel suffers from that. There are a lot of bubbles. As you can see in this graph, the third stage occurs the largest time per microbatch. So everyone has to wait for that stage, and there thus creates a lot of bubbles. So based on the NVIDIA's experiment, they show that the optimal solution would be combining all these parallelization techniques together. As you can see here, they open both pipeline parallel and tensor parallel. So then this creates into a new error that is called the 3D parallel. We add both data parallel, tensor parallel, and pipeline parallel together. That is the 3 dimension here. And to express the 3D parallel, we have to introduce some concepts. One is called the mesh. A mesh is an ND dimension array of identical processors. And you can see if you just execute along one dimension of those processors, you're doing one dimension of the parallelizations. So we mainly study the 2D mesh instead of the 3D here, because the 2D mesh are aligned with the network topology. And later on, we'll express how do we use the 2D meshes to show the 3D parallelization actual strategy. So different 2D mesh are executing different pipeline stages. And the second concept is called the sharding spec. You can understand it as a partition strategy. That is how we partition a tensor, an operator, or that kind of thing onto a mesh. So we can partition each dimension of the tensor onto each dimension of the mesh. So that corresponds to the tensor model parallel, because we mentioned that tensor model parallel is to partition a single operator, or the data parallel, because data parallel is to partition the data dimension of the tensor. So here we give some examples of the sharding spec or the partition strategy. So here's a tensor that typically happen in the transformer models. It has a batch dimension, sequence length dimension, and a hidden size dimension. And here we have a mesh with 2 dimensions. So we can map each dimension of the mesh onto each dimension of the tensor. That is what you can see in the first row. And in the second row, we sometimes only map one dimension of the mesh into one dimension of the tensor, while letting the tensor or the tensor shard be replicated on the other dimension of the mesh. So, and also we can even do something more, that we map 2 mesh dimensions onto one tensor dimension. That is the third column in the second row. So that is very expressive for all kinds of partitions. And why we have the third column in the second row is something called the mixture of expert, where they propose something called the expert parallel. It will do something like that. So given the partition strategy, we can say that the 3D parallelism can be expressed by 2 things. One is the partition, which corresponds to the tensor model parallel and data parallel, while the other is called the schedule, which corresponds to the pipeline parallel. So as we can see, the left graph is the original computational graph, which has 2 math models, while the right graph is the expression of the total parallelization strategy, where we show that in each subgraph we have some partitions, and we have 2 subgraphs with some schedules. So that leads to a new challenge for us. That is the communication between 2 subgraphs. As still the example here, in the left part, that is the pipeline stage 1, we have the tensor be tensor parallelized. At here, it is a column partition, while in the right graph, it is data parallelized. So it is a row partitioned. And how can we communicate something that is column partition to a row partition one? That is a new challenge. We call it the cross-mesh resharding problem. And here we show that why it is new. A cross-mesh resharding means that you had a tensor with a specific shape, and you want to translate it from one mesh, that is one group of devices, to another mesh, that is another group of devices. And the tensor has two partition strategies on the two meshes. And previously, we have something called the collective communications, which is well developed in the HPC area. However, at there, you just translate something from one partition strategy to another partition strategy on the single mesh. For example, one example is all-gather. All-gather tries to gathering the tensor onto a mesh, onto a dimension. So you can say that it translates the tensor from some dimension partition into a replicated tensor, but they are always onto a one mesh, and that's a key difference. So our proposed solution to that is a hierarchical or multi-level optimization, but during each level, we guarantee that once the lower level is already optimal, then the higher level and the higher level is optimal, then we can reach the global optimal solution. So to begin with, we define the unit task, which splits the level of the optimization. First, we just optimize onto a unit task, and then we optimize multiple unit tasks inside a single cross-mesh resharding, and finally, we optimize the cross-mesh resharding overall pipeline execution. So a unit task is defined with a tile. A tile is, as you can see here, it's a partition of the tensor. And a tile corresponds to some shared part from the sender and the receiver. So it is based on the partition strategy here. If you just send from row partition to row partition, then the tile is just some rows. But if you send from the row partition to a column partition, as the right graph shows, then a tile is both partition on the row and the column. So tile shows some similarity between the sender and the receivers. And then we can see that a cross-mesh resharding task can be expressed by multiple the end-to-end tile tasks. So still, as the graph shows here, one end-to-end task corresponds to one color here. So here, as always, N is always 1, while M is always 2 in this example. And so we begin with how to optimize a single unit task. That is a single end-to-end task here. So we first define that what is the optimal end-to-end task or the unit task. So in this task, we'll have multiple receivers, and each receiver will receive at least one replica of the information. So the optimal time for each receiver is the tile size divided by bandwidth. And we can see that the optimal time for the total task is also the tile size divided by bandwidth, because all receivers can execute in parallel. And we'll see that when they reach the optimal time, then all receivers are fully utilized. So how do we guarantee that lower bound? There are already some previous works. One is the Megatron LM. It's the most famous framework to train the transformer in the distributed training context. And the second is Alpha. It is also our work. So they both solve the problem using some all-gather-based approach. The graph here shows some different sending topologies. And the orange arrows are the network, while the green arrows are something very fast, as NVLinks or any just in-node connections, whose time can be just ignored. So we focus on to reduce the orange arrow here. As you can see, the B plane has a lot of orange arrows, but we think that they can be reduced to A or C plans. And A or C are just similar. A is just the Megatron LM stuff, because Megatron LM cannot solve the C's topology. But they have the same logic. That is to offload some communications from the orange part to the green part using the all-gather. And what we observe in experiment is that, as you can see, the all-gather execution order is like this. You have to send and to receive, and then all-gathering the two tiles by the send receive. But if the all-gather itself can be take a lot of time, then the total latency is also really costly. And also the all-gather approach leads to something like new paddings, copying, or indexing operations, because you have to slice them first and then to gather that later. So you have to manually implement that, which results in a lot of overheads, because you have to also launch a lot of CUDA kernels, and the launching itself resulting in a lot of overhead. However, we found that this is equivalent to something like a broadcast. As we show in the left graph, if you just want to send from one GPU to multiple receiver GPUs, you can just tile them and broadcast with the streaming stuff, with the streaming algorithms. So on the right graph, we show that the timeline based on the broadcast is much shorter when the all-gather takes really a long time. And the all-gather is almost optimal because there's only some slicing and streaming overheads, which can be always just neglected. So assume that now we already use the broadcast to reach the optimal for a single unit task. What next we'll do is that we want to scheduling the multiple unit tasks to inside the whole cross-mesh resharding. So we found that the single unit task already reached a group property that whenever it is executed, then all receivers in that task is already fully utilizing its bandwidth. So if we can guarantee that at any time any receiver is executing a unit task, then at any time any receiver is fully utilizing their bandwidth. So that is the global optimal for the whole cross-mesh resharding task. And when will it not be guaranteed? So here we show some examples. The left part is something called the workload imbalance. If you can send something from two senders, but you set them to be from the single sender, then you just waste some time. And the right side is some imbalanced schedule. As you can see that one receiver needs to receive from two senders, but if the two senders are scheduled to send at the same time, then the receiver have to just receive from one sender, and that resulting in some waste of the time. So what we do here is that we formulate the problem using some expression to show the exclusive of the single unit task, and then we try to set some optimization targets. Our base approach is that at the same time, that is the constraint at the second row. That is, at the same time, two tasks cannot be overlapped if they share some same sender or some same receivers. And then we formulate the problem with the simplest objective. And we prove that this one is at least NP hard. So we failed to figure out a good algorithm to just find the solution. And And so we just use some search-based algorithms to figure out the solution. And finally, we came to the scheduling of all the cross-mesh resharding tasks during the whole pipeline execution. The challenge we find here is that, firstly, the cross-mesh resharding are not very intense. They are very sparse. At the graph here, we show that only at the boundary of 2 blocks here, we have the cross-mesh resharding. So you can see that at the red rectangular, so the second row and the third row have some communications, while the first row doesn't interact with the second or the third row. So they are very sparse and very local, and we don't need to just schedule cross-mesh resharding tasks at the same time. We can just consider them task by task. But what is the challenge here? We find that there are some data dependencies. So we cannot overlap the communication with computations here. Still at the second, at the red rectangular, you can see that the the blue 4 and the green 3 are data dependent, but they also have the communications. So the second blue 4 and the second green 3, they have to wait until the communication ends, then they can just start execution. So there are some idealness during this waiting. And what we find is that we can just cleverly reschedule them. So if we just do something in advance to create some opportunities for the overlapping, then we can just create some gaps between the execution of the data-dependent tasks, and then we can just communicate during the other tasks we're inserting between 2 data-dependent tasks. And further that we find by shifting the new schedule here, we can just overlap everything, or say we can insert something between 2 data-dependent tasks, between all of the 2 data-dependent tasks. All we need to mention is that we cannot touch those with those blocks with the red boundaries, because they are the constraint for the they are the hard constraint for the total latency. And all other blocks can be just shifting here and there. And by the shifting, we can create some opportunities for overlapping the communications with the computations now. And then we do some evaluations. So we're from academic, so we only have 2 AWS P.3.8 instances, each with 4 V100 GPUs, NVIDIA connected. And the network bandwidth is really low. It is only 10 Gbps. And we think that the upper bound is assume that the network is really, really fast, that takes no time. Then that is our upper bound. So we just mimic that by only sending 1 byte for each communications. And our baseline is Megatron LLM workload balanced approach in alpha, and also some real work from Microsoft. They are trying to use the streaming algorithm to optimize the communications. So we use the broadcast in our approach to mimic them. And in our micro benchmark, we show that our scheduling and our broadcast-based approach is really fast. It can always reach the bandwidth provided by the NVIDIA. Oh, sorry, by the AWS. So it's about 10 Gbps. That is the bandwidth. We can fully utilize the bandwidth. And and here for multiple just resharding tasks, we enumerate a lot of sharding specs or say partition strategies, and still we can always reach the ideal bandwidth utilization rate. And here is the end-to-end tasks. The end-to-end task shows that on GPT or U-transformer, which is the backbone of the diffusion model, we can always reach the hypothetical upper bound, the brown run. that is, we assume the network is really, really fast and takes no time. We can always reach or almost reach that part. And we also collaborate with NVIDIA to show on some very large cluster, very large A100 clusters. We can accelerate for up to 30% on the OPT 175 billion models, or on T5X models on the 2.8 clusters. Yeah, and what is the use of that for the sustainability? I think as the first graph shows that the very high bandwidth network is costly, and you have to iterate for every generation of that. So it is, but in our approach, we show that even with the 10 Gbps bandwidth, you can still reach the hypothetical upper bound. So that means that you don't need to use that very high bandwidth networks. And I think that is very good for energy saving or a resource saving, because you don't need to just update your networks. Yeah, and that's all. Thanks for listening.
Yes, so it's now time for questions and answers, and I actually have one question for you. So if we think about the fact that the goal so far of the ALPA project has been to reduce the communication overhead as much as possible, right? Either by actually reducing the number of messages, the size of the messages, or simply overlapping communication and computation better, right? These are like the three ways that you get the communication down. Ultimately, less communication means faster training iterations. Faster training iterations means less energy and carbon usage because you don't have processors doing burning power while doing nothing. Now, I want to probe your thoughts a little bit. So let's say hypothetically, we get to the point where there's no more communication savings to be had, right? Either because we've overlapped all the communication that could possibly be overlapped, or it's because we've through finding the optimal partitioning, right? Optimal parallelization strategies, we've cut down the number of messages to its absolute minimum. But even then, you can still imagine that, okay, if communication was no longer a cost at all, you'd still have, for a large model, say the size of GPT-3 or larger, right? It would still be a very large number of floating point operations to compute. So thus, my question and maybe my challenge to the ALPA community is, how can we go beyond just the communication savings and find other ways to actually get the floating point operation cost of models down, right? As a parallel compiler, right, there's room for ALPA to expand to other types of optimizations. Not least, for example, quantization techniques or other types of model compression techniques, or even ways to approximate computation faster. And that can only be really done in a holistic parallel compiler framework, because you do not want to be combining techniques from two different families without actually optimizing them as a single joint program. So I know that description was a little bit technical, but basically I'm pointing to where I think the future of AI sustainability needs to head at a technical level. So I want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a good point for that. And actually, we have some ongoing projects about that. One example is that we know there's something called the checkpointing, which is to save the memory cost. And checkpointing is actually to recompute whenever you want to use that value. But definitely we know that recompute costs a lot of extra flops. So we have some ongoing projects about that. Can we co-design the parallelization strategy with the recompute strategy? Yeah, we want to, for example, selectively recompute something, but definitely it should still be under the memory constraint. So how do we know that, for example, if we do some more parallelizations, definitely that will result in more communications later on. But what if that result in less recomputation requirements? Because if you partition more, definitely the memory cost will be less. So that will result in less communications, less recomputations. And those less extra flops, it worse because the extra communications can be, for example, overlapped or can be much less than the recomputation flop cost. Then, yeah, I guess that's one direction we were trying to explore. Yeah, and that's not a trivial combination of the both techniques. So yeah, it's undergoing.
Right. And I think my thoughts on that are, in addition to, and I know I was the one that brought up the flops question, right? But in addition to measuring flops or naive wall time, I think there is a interesting example to be learned from the very first talk today, which was Ebtisam's talk on Noor, that actually what we eventually care about as a society is, well, time to finish training is certainly one metric, wall time, but we also care about energy usage and carbon consumption, right? And I think these are actually, especially for big models, because all of these quantities become non-trivial for a large model, this is actually a type of study that I believe the community needs to shift towards, so that we are not blind to the actual cost, which we often, don't report. We're too embarrassed to say how many dollars we spent on AWS for some of these experiments, right?
Yeah.
Right. So this is just my advice to all young systems researchers, right? Which is consider the societal variables and use that as the metrics. Report that, and if possible, optimize for that.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah. That's what we wanna explore for a bit. Yeah, as we mentioned, we're just at the first step, I guess.
Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you so much, and I think that's a very impressive presentation, and especially for the optimization part, as you mentioned, you are using a 3-level optimization, and my question would be, for the 3-level optimization, are you in practical term, are you doing the optimization like step by step, or actually you are optimizing the whole mathematical model as a whole? I'm leading with one single objective function.
Actually, like the lowest level optimization is just to replace some previous previous implementation to a newer one. So it is there's no optimization objective there, and for the other 2 level, we optimize that one by one because we think they are isolated. As we mentioned, that the highest level shows that, say the second level is about a single communication, and the highest level shows that the single communication is very sparse, so we don't need to co-optimize between the single level, the single communication task and the scheduling of all these tasks, because we believe that they are too sparse, then no 2 tasks can happen together.
Makes sense. It looks to me that if you do the optimization step by step, you will have to wait for the result, like one by one, in order to do the whole optimization, because it looks to me that like cross mesh or all cross mesh, actually there are just constraints. Like cross mesh is like constraints between mesh and mesh, and all cross mesh is like it's like you adding some constraints between the different clusters of the cross mesh. So instead of my question would be, which part do you think it will be most challenging if you were trying to do the optimization? I mean, from a mathematical point of view, if you are doing the optimization as a whole. A single optimization, where do you think is the most challenging part?
Okay, so thanks for that. So for the scheduling of all these communications, it's not that hard because we just do that following one principle. That is to do some computation in advance to make there enough scenes to consume. By consume, we mean that to send from one mesh to another. So once there is enough scene to consume, you can just stop here because you don't want to continue doing that. That will just result in just redundant memory consumptions. So, but for the scheduling inside inside a single cross-mesh communication, it's really hard, as we proved that it is NP hard. So we actually just use some pruning-based search to solve that, and we believe that there will be some better solutions. Yeah.
I got it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
All right. Last check for any questions from the audience. Okay. And anyone able to help me check if there's any questions online in the Zoom, AV crew? No questions. Perfect. Okay, then with that, we are now at the end of our second session. So let's thank the speaker once more. And we will now have a coffee break. It will be about 40 minutes long, 40, and we will come back for the third session at 4:15 p.m. All right, so everyone, thank you, and let's take a break.